For years, the reconnaissance wizards of the Allied High Command, those shadow-bound sorcerers in the blackout-veiled huts of Medmenham and the sunlit plotting rooms of Bushy Park, had pored over the silvered ghosts of aerial plates, like oracles divining the entrails of a fallen foe, their oblique lenses capturing the squat casemates of Pointe du Hoc, etched against the Norman cliffs, like concrete sentinels guarding the Channel's throat. 6 hulking 155mm guns, nestled within, their barrels poised to hurl 15-mile shells into the invasion armada's vitals, with a fury that could shred landing craft and sink destroyers before the first boot touched sand. They had scrutinized those grainy images from April and May of 1944. The de Havilland Mosquito's daring sweeps, slicing through flak bursts to etch the battery's silhouette in unyielding nitrate, and decreed with the unyielding certainty of men who had unraveled Enigma's knots that this was the keystone in Hitler's Atlantic Wall, a spectral threat demanding a pre-dawn scalping by the 2nd Ranger Battalion, those thrice-volunteered phantoms who would claw up the 100-foot bluffs in a blitz of grapnels and thermite, spiking the phantom menace to safeguard the 34,000 souls churning toward Omaha's Crimson Crescent. They believed the climb would be a doctrinal dagger, 90 minutes of vertical valor, redeeming the ghosts of Dieppe, with a casualty calculus of 90%, but absolute salvation for Overlord's western flank. They were catastrophically wrong. And the story of exactly how that aerial mirage forged a suicide blueprint, the precise cascade of overlooked shadows and rope-burn descents that transmuted a futile phantom chase into a defiant perch, rerouting the Reich's reserves, is a chronicle of war's razor-thin alchemy, where the sharpest intelligence can conjure castles from clouds, only for human sinew to claim the crags and rewrite the invasion's spine. It is tempting, with the hindsight of weathered monuments and faded dog tags glinting in the point's eternal wind, to dismiss this faith in phantom plates as the hubris of photo-interpreters who had never tasted chalk dust or gripped a frayed etria. Yet, in the fraught bloom of that 1944 spring, as Kent's orchards pinked the hedgerows and Detroit's forges birthed Higgins boats by the fleet, their conviction hummed with the inexorable logic of a coalition that had scripted the Wehrmacht's unraveling, turning Rommel's desert wraiths into the Bocage's beleaguered shades. Operation Overlord, that titanic reclamation of a continent's soul, was the zenith of Anglo-American martial fusion, a grand score composed by the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force under Dwight D. Eisenhower's steady patrician gaze, where Whitehall's chessboard caution intertwined with Washington's industrial torrent to feint Hitler's legions toward the Pas-de-Calais mirage, while Normandy's seams yawned invitingly, 5 beaches from Utah's pastoral hush to swords-hedged snarls, with Omaha the forge where Vicor's hammer would strike hardest, its bloodied lodgment the hinge linking west to east, and Cherbourg's prize to Caen's crossroads. Pointe du Hoc, that anvil's jagged spur thrusting like a shattered incisor 4 miles west of Omaha's tide-scoured arc, loomed as the spectral fulcrum, its battery a stiletto over the Armada's throat, the 6 captured French K4-18 howitzers, each a 14-ton behemoth spitting 2 to 4 rounds per minute over 24-mile arcs, calibrated for enfilade carnage alongside the mazy strongpoints to the west, a scything zone that could gut the Texas's broadsides and mulch the 29th Division's waves before ramps dropped. The planners, cloistered in Norfolk House's oak-paneled sanctums, had divined this peril from an inundation of oracle's ink, Ultra's decrypted enigma rivulets from Bletchley's whirring bombs unveiling dispositions to the platoon, SOE saboteurs moonlight. Lysander dropped smuggling grid squares from the Orne's gloaming, and the Mosquito's relentless obliques that silvered the point's contours, unveiling 6 casemates in a defensive crescent atop the bluff, each a monolithic vault of 2-foot-thick concrete veiling the guns' muzzles, their seaward slits sweeping the channel like the unblinking eyes of a vigilant colossus. What those plates unveiled only fortified this doctrinal certitude, sketching Pointe du Hoc not as an unscalable bastion, but as a fragile emblem of German attenuation, a locus where the Atlantic walls boasted 2 million tons of ferro-concrete and rebar, thinned to a brittle patina garrisoned by the Wehrmacht's detritus, elements of the 726th Infantry Regiment from the 716th Static Infantry Division, a mosaic of Osttruppen levies from the steppes' vast desolation, Ukrainians and Poles whose triggers twitched with Stalingrad's spectral chill, and whose MG-42s stuttered in Normandy's clammy grip. The 2nd Ranger Battalion, that paragon cadre of 225 souls, thrice volunteered from the army's fibrous ranks and annealed in the raid phantasmagorias of Aknakari's Highland Crags and Slapton Sands' surrogate scarps, was the lancet honed for this lancing, activated in April of 1943 at Camp Forest beneath Lieutenant Colonel James E. Rudder's unyielding Texan scrutiny, a West Point tactician whose laconic burr veiled a resolve of tempered anvil steel. These were men who had pledged their all in the Camp Forest muster, enduring the Ranger crucible of 50-mile forced marches and live-fire gauntlets, their etriers and carabiners slung like talismans, their psyches burnished by Derby's Raiders Dieppe dirge of 1942, which proved cliffs could be crested if the climber's mettle eclipsed the escarpment's scorn. The mandate, unfurled in Rudder's Falmouth tent amid the brine's tang and the canvas's drip on May 28th, decreed 10 LCAs from the HMS Prince Charles, threading the minefields at 0630, grapnels lancing skyward beneath the Satterley and Taliban's naval aegis, the Rangers to crest in 20 minutes, immolate the guns in 30 more, then wheel inland to barricade the Vierville Grand Camp artery, their vigil a barb impeding the 914th Infantry Regiment of the 352nd Divisions. Mazy musters, all while the 1st and 29th Divisions 34,000, churned toward Omaha's sanguine embrace 5 miles eastward. This blueprint of lethal choreography found its profoundest mooring in the cultural bedrock of Allied praxis, a worldview alchemized from the Enlightenment's surveyor's zeal and the assembly line's prodigal bounty, elevating conflict from bayonet's barbarity to a probabilistic ledger, where each datum was assayed and armored by the celestial vantage of the overhead eye. The combined chiefs of staff, in their oceanic missives from Pentagon to Whitehall, had enthroned aerial reconnaissance as Overlord's lodestar, apportioning 200 sorties in May to the point alone, the Lockheed Lightning's K-24 optics chronicling the battery's metamorphosis from half-entombed tubes to bastioned lairs, their dispatches sealed with Schaeff's imprimatur affirming the gun's entrenchment, the casemates' slits oriented seaward like inexorable stairs. General Omar Bradley, the myopic maven of First Army, incarnated this creed in his May 20th edict, charging Rudder's cohort with Omaha's westerly wardenship, the ascent a parenthesis in the Grand Pas de Deux, where 5,000 keels would disgorge 156,000 legionaries, 9,000 gliders would span the Orne, and 48,000 airborne would sow disarray in the Cotentin's creases, the Point's purgation forecast as a 90-minute intermezzo with attrition pegged below 50, an actuarial aside to the Armada's cataclysm. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, terrestrial maestro of Overlord, buttressed this arithmetic in his valedictory exhortation, christening the Rangers the spear's foremost barb, their vault a paradigmatic vertical envelopment, grapnels and toggle ropes outflanking the wall's lateral sprawl, inverting Rommel's immobile bastions into perpendicular pitfalls of their devising. Yet what imbued this Pointe du Hoc covenant with such mesmeric potency for the tacticians diagramming timelines on slate was the ulterior exigency it subserved in deception's grand mask, a silken decoy in Operation Fortitude's spectral ballet that transfixed Hitler's scrutiny on the Pas-de-Calais apparition, while Normandy slumbered in contrived quiescence, the battery's barrels a sacrificial lodestone luring Luftwaffe vigils and panzer phalanxes westward. Erwin Rommel, the Wüstenfuchs whose Africa phantasms had capered Montgomery to exhaustion, had verily buttressed the point with a fervour distilled from his Tunisian terminus, his January inquests exhuming a promontory pitted with nascent pits and unmanned redoubts, igniting a paroxysm that carpeted 6 million telemines along the littorals, reared 18,000 impediments from tetrahedrons to hedgehogs, and sighted 500 casemates athwart the quintet of strands, the points, sextet of howitzers the diadem's jewels, their Gallic provenance a paean to the Reichsrapine, each bore tended by 81 shades of the 716th's immobile cadre, their esprit eroded by the interminable ululation of Allied klaxons that had pockmarked Caen's aprons and Cherbourg's quays. Yet to the Allied ken, Refracted through Ultra's aureate efflux decrypting 4/5 of Oberkommando chatter by May, this was a domicile of spades, Rommel's sextet edict begetting a bulwark as perforated as the Bocage's primordial byways, the immobile division's Osttruppen assistant of the enfeebled, their 15% apostasy, a susurrus in the Marquise's ear, their MG-42s muted by the vow of naval tempests from the Texas's 14-inch Leviathans and the Satterlee's 5-inch staccatos, a prefatory maelstrom of 13,000 tons to into the lairs ere the Premier Hose Nord chalk. This was the doctrinal quintessence of the Allied phantasmagoria, a dogma as incised as the brine in a pilot's beard, that the firmament's vigil was omniscient, a celestial adjudicator rendering the foeman's arcana as pellucid as a novice's primer, sanctioning Overlord's libretto with the poise of a Baroque cantata, each LCA's ramp's declension calibrated to the tick, and every embrasure's eclipse predestined in triune superimpositions. The Chef Intel Précis of May 30th, that taut dossier swathed in khaki, had canonized the Pointe's ordnance as immobile wardens, the K418's loci triangulated to cubits from the Mosquito's slants, the Gallic operatives' mutterings of displacement consigned to the collaborators' haze, their poem-encrypted epistles assayed against the ultra-orthodoxy and adjudged deficient, the balances inclining toward the battery's perpetuity. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder, in his Falmouth pavilion amid the reek of sodden fleece and mechanism oil, interrogated the mandate's tenability in a May 28th colloquy with Clarence Hubner of the 1st Division. Yet the fiat endured unmodified, the blueprints artificers in London deeming the peril of recant insufferable, the Rangers' vault a bulwark against the spectre that might yet bellow, their 90% ablation a sombre compact sealed in the Colonel's tacit incline, the battalion's 225 umbras unwitting of the decoy stanchions awaiting, as they mustered the Prince Charles's davits. But even as these prognostications deluged the cryptograms and maquettes, faint discords fretted the veneer of this immaculate simulacrum, susurrations from the penumbras intimating a perturbation beneath the Teutonic pall, reconfigurations that the High Command, enthralled by the aerial vaticinator's enchantment, docketed as aberrations in the tally of supremacy. In late May, as the pre-assault aerials pummeled the point with over 400 tons from B-25s and Lancasters, gouging the apex into selenic pocks and entombing 2 howitzers in detritus, the residual quartet was surreptitiously translocated by the 716th Sappers, trailered beneath Nocturnal's cowl to Les Dungs's Pomarian groves, 400 yards southeast in Hedgerow's thorny call, their bores veiled in mesh amid the Bocage's brambly clasp, sham telegraph uprights reared in the casemates to ape muzzles, a prestidigitation fleetingly limned in a June 2nd lightning foray, but eclipsed by flak coruscations and nebulous veils, the negatives decocted in Portsmouth's murk yielding umbras, the exegists docketed as upkeep refuse. The SOE's F-shades, those idolic personae like Violette Sabo airdropped into the Orne's gloaming, relayed the transposition via eruptive broadcasts on June 3rd, their intimations of Kanonen versetzt, fizzing through Bletchley's bombs, only to jar the ascendant chronicle. The philologists' marginalia interred in codicils as the go-no-go terminus loomed, Eisenhower's June 4th decree enshrining the onslaught amid Force 3 surges and riven firmaments. To the G2 savants imbibing brackish drafts in the cabinet war rooms, this was marginal susurrus. The Ordnance's Bocage gambit a feint unworthy of the Rangers' metal, the 2nd Battalion's grapnels fated for chalk niches that would diadem the point ere the Matinata stirred. However, what ensued would disquiet even the most resolute cartographers in those submundane vaults, for the phantasm's fissures dilated not in the uproar of debarkation, but in the tacitum overture of mustering, an overture where the Suicide Covenant's script, parched on Rudder's behests amid the David's Creek, and the subdued murmur of Mal de Mer supplications. The Prince Charles, that impressed ferry transmuted into onslaught progenitor, churned from Weymouth at midnight on June 5th, her 10 LCAs suspended like sarcophagi from the davits, the Rangers' rucksacks gravid with 20-pound skeins of Manila and 50-foot escalade ladders filched from London's conflagration brigades, their Tommy guns lubricated against the clammy, while etriers pended from cinctures like amulets. Rudder, striding the bridge with a West Point engineer's myopic glare, pondered the SOE susurrus in the ampler couriers, a murmur clashing with the aerial orthodoxy, yet the colonel's tenacity crystallized in the channel's undulation, the battalion's companies D, E, and F arrayed in taciturn vigil. Their visages obscured by steel casques emblazoned with the ranger badge, volunteers who had avowed their all thricefold in the Camp Forest levy, now yoked for a bluff that bulked in colloquia as both warden and mausoleum. The spectral ordnance those evanescent bores evoked from nitrate and strategic fiat had engendered a covenant wherein 225 shades would contravene gravity and vanguard, their vault the fulcrum whereupon Overlord tottered, a doctrinal wager wherein intelligence's phantasmagoria encountered the adamantine chalk, vowing not mere purgation but the conflict's axle in the saline smart of Aurora. As the LCAs unmoored at 4:30, the points contour a sable fang athwart the spurious skyline. The suicide's cantata impended to unfold, its motifs of cord chafe and grenade rumble unveiling the gulf betwixt the beheld and the obscured, where rangers would vault not for vanished iron but for the plain, poignant verity of occupancy atop the unattainable. As the first tentative glow of June 6, 1944, began to bleed through the channel's low-lying scud, painting the Armada's steel flanks in hues of bruised pewter and reluctant gold, the 10 LCAs slung from the HMS Prince Charles's davits slipped their moorings around 4:30, with the quiet inevitability of coffins committed to the tide, each wooden hull crammed shoulder to shoulder with 30-plus rangers whose packs sagged under the weight of 50-foot extension ladders, 20-pound coils of manila rope, and the brittle promise of Bangalore torpedoes, their etriers dangling from belts like talismans against the deep's malice. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder, braced on the bridge amid the reek of diesel exhaust and the low retch of seasick anticipation, watched his flotilla fan into the pre-dawn murk under the watchful silhouettes of the destroyers Satterlee and HMS Talibont, those lithe greyhounds whose 5-inch and 4-inch batteries were scripted to soften the Pointe du Hoc's fang before the grapnels flew, the old but mighty battleship Texas looming farther out like a slumbering leviathan, her secondary guns already warming to the barrage that would herald the assault. The briefers had etched this transit as doctrinal seamlessness, a 40-minute glide through mine-swept narrows to touch the cliff base at 06:30 sharp, the naval thunder from 5:50 onward, cratering the casemates and stunning the 7/16th static watch into paralysis, leaving the Rangers to crest the 100-foot bluffs unmolested, their ropes biting chalk holds in a symphony of synchronized pull. What the Channel delivered instead was a cruel delays labyrinth, a 90-minute gauntlet of navigational treachery and bombardment's blind spot that hurled the flotilla not into a prelude of prepared dominance, but into a maelstrom where smoke and current conspired to blind the way, turning the velvet approach into a prelude of peril, where every roller mocked the planner's precision and every shadow hid the first sting of steel. The betrayal unfurled with the sea's own perfidy, a 3-knot lateral current that gripped the LCAs like an unseen riptide, tugging them eastward toward the distant thunder of Omaha's awakening, while the low scud veiled the point's silhouette in a traitorous fog. The coxswains, those Royal Navy tars whose tillers had guided Diepp's ghosts, straining at wheels slick with spray to pierce the murk, where navigational buoys should have beckoned, but instead lurked as phantom hazards amid the tide's ebbing hunger. From 5:50, the Texas's secondary batteries hammered the cliff with 5-inch salvos that cratered the tide flats a mile short, her spotters cursing through fogged binoculars as the fall of shot walked harmlessly seaward, the indirect chorus of her main 14-inch rifles joining only after 6:30, arcing blindly behind the smoke curtain that the May raid's lingering pall had thickened into a choking shroud, shells blooming orange against the bluff's face, but pulverizing Norman. Pastures rather than the casemates' armored hides, each half-ton behemoth whistling inland to gouge orchards, while the concrete tombs stood defiant, their apertures winking through the haze like unrepentant eyes. HMS Talibont, the nimble hunt class with her 4-inch quickfirers snapping like a barrister's gavel, added her remonstrance, point-blank rakes scouring the base where teller mines bobbed on the ebb, Yet the bombardment's scorecard, tallied in the Texas's fire control ledgers, unfolded as a litany of frustration. 2 casemates grazed, their slits chipped but unbreached, 3 gun pits pocked, but their innards vaporous mirages. The central observation post splintered, yet its periscope swiveling. With mechanical spite, piping coordinates to the command dugout, where Oberleutnant Heinrich Meyer marshaled his 81 defenders, half Osttruppen, whose eastern scars lent grim poise, their reports of feindliche Schiffnahen spurring a stir amid the static ranks of the 726th Infantry Regiment. The relocated K418s in Ledang's distant groves now swiveling under netting, oblivious to the flotilla's plight, but primed for the eastern beach's roar. This opening unravelling, however, harboured the genesis of a profounder discord, a navigational vertigo that magnified the bombardment's myopia into a theatre of isolation where the current's grasp scattered the LCAs like chaff in a thresher, the lead boat under Captain Ralph E. Kent veering 200 yards wide as the 3-knot drift clawed eastward, her sisters trailing in a ragged skein that stretched the 10 hulls across a half-mile front by the time the Pointe's fang sharpened against the paling sky. The Satterlee, witnessing the drift from her prow, pivoted to rake the shallows with 5 inches that straddled unseen hazards, her captain's TBS corrections bellowing into jammed ether, while the Taliban's 4 inches joined to cow a machine gun nest at the base. Yet the enfilade from WN-72's MG-42s, those buzzsaw sentinels manned by the 726th's conscripts, crackled seaward, tracers stitching the waves like luminous barbs across the bows, the first stings claiming 2 from Company D's forward. Boat as bullets whined through gunnels, splintering wood and drawing blood before ramp met shingle. Rudder's LCA 861, bucking a rogue swell as the delay dragged toward 70 minutes, jammed her ramp half open against the current's sheer, dumping the colonel and his headquarters into thigh-deep surf littered with the flotsam of swamped auxiliaries, the Rangers wading the final 100 yards under a hail that felled 3, before boot-kissed pebble, their ladders clattering against the undercut lip where the Texas's indirect fury had loosed scree avalanches into treacherous drifts. The colonel's steady gaze masking the gnaw of doubt as he scanned the fractured flotilla. Company E's craft grounded hard on a submerged reef around 7:10, forcing a desperate swim that soaked packs and frayed ropes. Company F veering 300 yards west into cratered shallows, their grapnels arcing to foul overhangs that dropped the first climbers back into the drink. Amid this protracted bleed of timetable, the Rangers' riposte coalesced into a tapestry of visceral adaptation that eroded the blueprint's doctrinal struts, transmuting the silken transit into a quagmire of elemental reckonings where every grapnel's cast essayed not merely stone, but the fraying thread of resolve. Company D's survivors, clustered beneath the central traverse where the cliff's bulge loomed deepest, hurled their first irons around 7:15, the 5 grapnels, flung by Sergeant Len Lomel after a wade that claimed 2 to the current's drag, biting the softer chalk above the undercut with muffled thuds that reverberated like omens, the ropes uncoiling in sodden arcs to dangle like lifelines from perdition, the initial hauls a chain of grunts and slips, where Private First Class John Nelson's palms shredded on the manila, his etria swinging in the gusts that howled up the face like vengeful spirits. The 726th's awakening spite, coordinated from the dugout where Meyer rallied his Patchwork 81, escalated with coastal mortars zeroed on the beachhead, the 81mm tubes inland lobbing rounds that cratered the shingle and buried ladders in debris, one such cough severing a line and dropping a climber 40 feet to the rocks, his mate's cries a fleeting dirge amid the surf's indifference, while Rudder orchestrated from the base, his voice a lash, "Up those ropes! We're not here to drown." The colonel's calm a bulwark against the paralysis, as the tide clawed higher, narrowing the foothold to yards where Bangalore teams snipped wire under the mortar's walk, each cutter's bite a wager against the shrapnel that danced the waterline. The navigational snare's emotional levy registered in the ascender's tautening tendons, where the 90-minute tardiness manifested not as ledger entries, but as the visceral census of comrades consigned to the deep, men like those from the swamped LCA 860 whose packs sank with their etrias, forcing bare-handed hauls up the sheer face, while the Taliban's quickfirers silenced a mortar pit, only to draw an 88's reprisal that holed her superstructure, her withdrawal, a tacit concession. That left the flotilla to the cliff's solitary verdict. Rudder, directing the remnants into relays with fragments of Fiat, gripped a spare rope himself around 7:20, his ascent a measured plod that belied the wound awaiting higher. The 726th's pot shots from the lip, plucking at silhouettes like brambles in fog, one grazing a headquarters runner who tumbled but clung, his gasp a rare breach in the stoicism. This was no pristine chronicle of supremacy, but a chronicle daubed with endurance's ochre, where the Rangers' exactitude encountered the Channel's caprice, and the foreseen 40-minute glide elongated into an abyssal vigil, the grapnel's purchase a supplication against the stone's apathy, the doctrinal covenant eroding at the margins where Norman brine met martial mandate. The authentic rift, nonetheless, incised itself not in the sea's geometry, but in the garrison's nascent ire, where the 716th's torpor transmuted into tactical asperity that rendered the beachhead a funnel of retribution, the 726th's machine guns, MG-42s with their 1,000-round serpents fed from bluff-top layers, metamorphosing the landing into a harvest of exposure where each unveiled instant exacted levy, the Rangers' doctrinal vault inverted against the immobile bulwark's lopsided malice. As the delay crested toward 8 o'clock, with the sun's ascent baking the sweat from their brows, the toll accrued relentlessly. 70 Rangers pledged to the cords, 30 consigned or corralled, the strand a narrowing charnel where the tide's incursion drowned the afflicted's laments, Rudder's etheric entreaties to the orbiting adjuncts, point assailed, ascending presently, lingering unheeded as the Satterlee's contour dissolved eastward, her commander's reckoning deeming the tariff exorbitant for the fume-veiled hazard. This snare's perils mounted with the mortal quotient stark arithmetic, the ascender's seclusion, magnifying the escarpment's psychical clamp where every faltered clasp murmured of the abyss beneath. The Rangers distilled to a collage of solitary sagas amid the communal attrition. Lamel's phalanx on the median cord traversing a 70-foot protuberance under grenade salvo, his Tommy gun slung rearward as he wedged a crag with sanguine knuckles, the Osttruppen aloft lobbing mashers that erupted in shrapnel's bouquet, one shard carving Petty's flank, but goading him to heave a toppled comrade with mandible-clenched vehemence, their etrias oscillating in cadence like a mortal chronometer against the lithic hush. The 726th's immobile frailty, those immobile essences schooled for lateral redoubts, engendered unanticipated asperity in the perpendicular realm, their boulders and wire cascades rendering the facade a lethal snare where the Rangers' paramount thew encountered inexorable bulk. The vault's impetus, a tenuous filament spun from volition solitary, vowing a diadem where the spectral ordnance tarried not in rumble, but in the vacuous resonance of their illusion. As the forenoon veered toward 8:30, the snare's anvil blazed fiercer, its mallets the sibilance of chords and the pant of lungs, the Rangers' attrition a threnody of recalcitrance where every niche ascended, inscribed the artificer's phantasmagoria in gore, smithing from perpendicular perdition a eyrie, whose tenure would yet staunch the Teutonic surge, the unattainable not merely surmounted, but seized in the snare's unrelenting blaze. As the delayed flotilla finally scraped its hulls against the Pointe du Hoc's tide-scoured base around 7:15, the Rangers spilling from their LCAs into the thigh-deep surf like phantoms ejected from wooden sarcophagi, the cliff loomed above them, not as the softened escarpment promised by the briefers' smoke-shrouded salvos, but as a vertical abyss of sheer, rain-slicked chalk that defied the very notion of ascent, its 100-foot face undercut by 30 feet of bulging overhang like the snarling jaw of some primordial beast, pocked with fissures that wept seepage and laced with the loose scree avalanched by the Texas's indirect thunder, a wall that seemed less climbable than vengeful, ready to swallow the grapnels and crush the climbers who dared its maw. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder, wading ashore from LCA 861 with water sheeting from his pack and the Channel's chill gnawing at his resolve, surveyed the fractured beachheads, 3 tenuous clusters beneath the traverses where Company D hunkered central, E to the east, F scraping the west, his voice a steady bellow cutting through the surf's roar and the distant cough of inland mortars. "Ropes up now. We're not here to admire the view." The doctrine had scripted this vault as a 20-minute relay of synchronized leverage, Etria's hauling the elite cadre to the crest before the 716th's static watch could stir from their dugouts, the MG-42 nests cowed by the Satterlee's point-blank 5 inches and the Taliban's 4-inch staccato, leaving the Rangers to fan across the summit unmolested, their thermite kisses sealing the phantom guns in a haze of magnesium fury. What the Abyss exacted instead was a 70% toll of blood and bone in the first hour alone. A tactical maelstrom of grenades and enfilade, where the undercut's bulge turned every rope into a noose and every hold into a betrayal, isolating companies into desperate silos of survival, and forging from doctrinal elegance a grind of improvised agony that tested not just sinew, but the soul's unyielding tether to the mission's fraying thread. The Abyss's opening salvo erupted from its flanks, where the 726th Infantry Regiment's machine gun crews, those Osttruppen levies whose hands still bore the phantom frost of the Dnieper's winters, rallied from their bluff-top bunkers to unleash a withering enfilade down the traverses, the MG-42's interlocking webs chattering at 600 rounds per minute to stitch the air with leaden lace that plucked at the first grapnel teams like scythes through ripe wheat. Company D massed beneath the central traverse, where the overhang's shadow pooled deepest like ink in a chalice, committed first around 7:20, Sergeant Len Lomel's squad hurling their irons upward in a desperate fusillade after the wade that had claimed 2 to the current's claw. The 5 grapnels' barbed heads trailed from sodden Manila, arcing through the haze to bite the softer chalk above the bulge, with muffled impacts that reverberated like the knell of distant bells. The ropes, uncoiling in weighted arcs to dangle like salvific nooses from the void, the initial haul's a concatenation of strained heaves and precarious perches, where Private First Class John Nelson's palms shredded on the frayed fibers. His étriers, those canvas stirrup slings looped through carabiners, swinging in the updraft's malice like pendulums tuned to the grave. A grenade lobbed from WN-72's nest burst midway up the first line around 7:25. Its potato masher shrapnel carving Nelson's leg in a spray of chalk and crimson, the blast's concussion snapping his rope and sending him tumbling 40 feet to the shingle below. His cry a fleeting requiem amid the surf's indifference, while Lommel bellowed from the base, "Haul harder, for Nelson," the squad's doctrinal relay fracturing into a brute chain where each climber's weight yanked the next. Into the fire's funnel, the undercut's 30-foot jut forcing a desperate traverse under the MG's spite, bullets whining off the bulge to spall fragments that scarred faces and hands like the Abyss's own barbs. This visceral levy, however, veiled a tactical chasm that magnified the cliff's savagery beyond the sand table's sanitized contours. For the bombardment's blind spot, those Texas 14 inches arcing indirect behind the May raid's lingering pall, had honeycombed the face with treacherous scree slopes and false ledges, transmuting the vertical into a labyrinth of crumbling betrayal, where every Etria's step invited avalanche, the Rangers' extension ladders, those 50-foot fire relics lashed. With auxiliary hemp, wedged precariously against the overhang's curve, their rungs bowing under dual loads as 2 men clambered in tandem, the wood groaning like a deathbed confession. Company E, under the gut-shot Lieutenant Thomas Sullivan, who directed from the shingle with a medic's hasty compress, pledged to the eastern traverse around 7:28, where the escarpment shallowed to 80 feet, but bristled with grassy tufts, veiling razor wire, their 6 grapnels cast by Sergeant Bill Petty's fire team, after a reef grounding that soaked half their loads, gripping firm but summoning immediate reprisal from the observation post's Mauser nest. The sentries aimed fire, plucking a climber mid-haul, his body jerking like a marionette before the severed rope whipped downward to brain a mate below, the survivors recoiling the line in a tangle of curses and canvas, while Sullivan's radio crackled futile pleas to the withdrawing Talibant, her 4 inches thundering a parting rake that cratered the post's revetment but left the wire's thorns intact, the Rangers resorting to bare-knuckled tears through the coils, their gloves eviscerated and flesh lacerated as the tide's inexorable creep submerged the last dry perches, turning the beach into a wading charnel where Bangalore detonations cleared fleeting gaps only for mortars to refill them with rubble and regret. What came next shocked the haulers even more viscerally, for the mortal arithmetic of the abyss commenced to unveil its concealed exactions, not in the spectacle of plummets, but in the banal barbarities of abrasion and exhaustion, a toil that bared the gulf between rehearsed poise and the escarpment's whimsical physiognomy, where the rope's drenched droop exacted double the heave, and the chalk's friable clasp rendered every niche a perfidy. By 7:40, as the sun's ascent seared the sweat from their hides, fewer than 40 rangers had ventured the cords, their cohorts sundered into improvised enclaves where Company F's Captain Otto Masny, vaulting the western face with an ad hoc ice axe forged from a Bangalore haft, spearheaded a phalanx of 12 whose Tommy guns yapped skyward to daunt the marksman, yet the overhang's protuberance compelled a lateral creep beneath grenade hail, Masny's tread betraying on a drizzle-glazed niche to dangle un-Emmanuel for a harrowing instant, his radio man yanking him aloft with a chafe that blistered to the quick, the captain's wheeze a scarce concession amid the phlegmatic toil. The 726th's riposte, orchestrated from the bunker where Meyer rallied his motley 81, intensified with coastal mortars calibrated on the foothold, the 81mm bores inland expectorating high explosive globules that pockmarked the strand and sepulchred ladders in detritus. One such eructation, bisecting a grapnel and precipitating 3 haulers 40 feet to the lithics, their plaints a counterpoint to the Satterlee's receding rumble as she sheered east, her commanders, reckoning deeming the outlay exorbitant for the fume-occluded peril, bequeathing the point to its solitudinous adjudication, the Rangers' etheric entreaties, point beleaguered, vaulting presently, lingering unrequited as the surge engulfed the ultimate arid toehold. The abyss's psychical impost registered in the ascender's tautening thews, where the 90-minute lag incarnated not as actuarial jottings, but as the corporeal roster of confrères remanded to the profound, men like those from the reef-swamped LCA 860, whose etrias foundered with their rucksacks, compelling unshod hauls up the precipice, while the Taliban's parting 4 inches cowed a mortar lair, only to provoke an 88's requital that perforated her carapace, her recession a tacit capitulation that consigned the armada to the escarpment's lonesome decree. Rudder, marshalling the leavings into relays with shards of edict, clasped a redundant cord himself circa 7:35, his vault a calibrated plod that dissimulated the lesion impending aloft. The 726th's desultory snaps from the brim, plucking at contours like brambles in mist, one grazing a headquarters courier who cascaded but clutched, his exhalation a singular fissure in the stoicism. This was no immaculate annals of hegemony, but an annals besmirched with tenacity's ochre, where the Ranger's meticulousness collided with the Channel's caprice, and the anticipated 40-minute glide protracted into an abysmal orison. The grapnel's adhesion a litany against the lithic apathy, the doctrinal covenant eroding at the peripheries where Norman spume encountered martial precept. The veritable crevasse, nonetheless, engraved itself not in the profound's lineaments, but in the garrison's nascent acrimony, where the 716th's lethargy transmuted into tactical asperity that transfigured the beachhead into a conduit of reprisal, the 726th's automatons, MG-42s with their millinery coils nourished from bluff-top layers, metamorphosing the debarkation into a garnering of revelation where each unveiled trice-levied impost, the Ranger's doctrinal vault, inverted against the immobile. Rampart's lopsided malevolence. As the lag peaked toward 8 o'clock, with the sun's acclivity calcining the exudation from their brows, the impost accrued inexorably. 70 Rangers avowed to the filaments, 30 consigned or corralled, the littorals a constricting sepulchre where the surge's encroachment inundated the tormented's plaints. Rudder's diaphanous adjurations to the gyrating adjuncts, point assailed, ascending presently, subsisting unheeded as the Satterlee's contour dissipated eastward, her commanders reckoning deeming the tariff exorbitant for the fume-veiled hazard. This snare's perils mounted with the mortal quotient stark arithmetic, the ascender's seclusion, magnifying the escarpment's psychical clamp where every faltered clasp murmured of the abyss beneath. The Rangers distilled to a collage of solitary sagas amid the communal attrition, Lomel's phalanx on the median chord traversing a 70-foot protuberance under grenade salvo, his Tommy gun slung rearward as he wedged a crag with sanguine knuckles, the Osttruppen aloft lobbing mashers that erupted in shrapnel's bouquet, one shard carving Petty's flank, but goading him to heave a toppled comrade with mandible-clenched vehemence, their etrias oscillating in cadence like a mortal chronometer against the lithic hush. The 726th's immobile frailty, those immobile essences schooled for lateral redoubts, engendered unanticipated asperity in the perpendicular realm, their boulders and wire cascades rendering the facade a lethal snare where the ranger's paramount thew encountered inexorable bulk. The vault's impetus, a tenuous filament spun from volition solitary, vowing a diadem where the spectral ordnance tarried not in rumble, but in the vacuous resonance of their illusion. As the forenoon veered toward 8:30, the snare's anvil blazed fiercer, its mallets the sibilance of chords and the pant of lungs, the ranger's attrition a threnody of recalcitrance where every niche ascended, inscribed the artificer's phantasmagoria in gore, smithing from perpendicular perdition a eyrie, whose tenure would yet staunch the Teutonic surge, the unattainable not merely surmounted, but seized in the snare's unrelenting blaze. But even as the first silhouettes crested the lip around 7:45, their boots grinding into the pockmarked grass like victors claiming a pyre, the abyss's toll lingered in the shadows below, a 70% harvest of blood that isolated the summit from the strand. The company's silos forging not just survivors, but spectres who would hold the heights with the fury of the fallen, their grapnels bite a vow against the void, promising a plateau where phantoms awaited not in thunder, but in the hollow jest of empty lairs, the vertical hell's forge yielding not defeat, but the unyielding perch that would yet pivot the war's inexorable wheel. As the first ragged silhouettes of the Rangers crested the Pointe du Hoc's battered summit around 7:45, their boots grinding into the pock-marked grass that crowned the bluff like a tattered crown scarred by the May raid's craters and laced with the barbed wire of hasty entrenchments, the air hung thick with the acrid bite of spent cordite and the metallic tang of bloodied chalk dust, a hush broken only by the wind's low moan through the shattered remnants of observation posts and the faint, mocking clatter of abandoned Mausers in the shallow trenches that ringed the plateau. Sergeant Leonard Lomel, his hands raw from the rope's merciless chafe, and his Tommy gun slung low across a shoulder, etched with the shrapnel's kiss from a grenade's spiteful burst midway up the traverse, led the vanguard of Company D over the eastern lip, his squad, 11 ghosts dwindled from 22 by the abyss's toll, fanning into the casemates with bayonets fixed and pulses hammering the doctrine's relentless drum, breach the lairs, spike the barrels, deny the phantom menace before its muzzles could belch defiance upon the armada, churning 5 miles east. The briefers had conjured this consummation as doctrinal apotheosis, the 6 K418 howitzers yawning from their concrete tombs like the maws of chained leviathans, their crews reeling from the Texas's indirect salvos and ripe for the thermite's searing embrace, the Rangers to immolate the steel in a haze of white-hot magnesium and vanish inland like avenging shades, their 90-minute vigil a thorn sealing Overlord's western seam. What unfolded upon the summit instead was a bitter jest of vacancy, the casemates gaping hollow as the promises that birthed them, their apertures blind, and the pits scarred by bombs but barren of iron thunder, the revelation crashing over Lomel like a rogue wave from the channel below. The guns were spectral illusions, trailered inland to Les Dong's shadowed orchard under the 7/16th's nocturnal cunning, a doctrinal betrayal that transmuted triumph's threshold into a mocking farce, the suicide's covenant redeemed not by annihilation, but by the raw, unquenchable drive to hunt the absent raw, to scour the bocage's veil before the 350 phalanxes could exploit the rift and unmake Omaha's fragile cradle. This summit, Jest's shockwave rippled through the arriving phalanxes like frost through marrow, a tactical vertigo that redoubled the climb's earlier barbarities into a tableau of redirected wrath. For the point's apex, that 100-acre expanse gashed by lunar pox and threaded with anti-tank ditches like the veins of a flayed colossus, emerged not as the haven of silenced steel, but as a contested limbo where the 726th's leavings, those 81 defenders under Oberleutnant Heinrich Meyer's bunker-bound grip, stirred to a feral vitality, their pre-dawn torpor yielding to a paroxysm of grenades and small arms venom that pinned the Rangers amid the open traverses. Private First Class John Nelson, his leg a mangled ruin from the grenade that had snapped his rope on the bulge, was hauled over the lip by two mates around 8 o'clock, collapsing into a shell hole flanking the central casemate, where his bar chattered vainly at phantoms in the cordite fog, a potato masher's eruption nearby peppering his flak jacket with steel confetti that spared his breath but claimed the radio man at his flank, the SCR 300's antenna crumpling like a reed in the gale. Rudder, ascending the median cord unscathed until a Mauser round from the observation post's ruins pierced his left calf near the crest around 7:40, crested the lip at 8, with Captain George Whittington bearing his weight. The colonel's wound, a throbbing distraction as he marshalled the muster. Secure the positions, fan for the guns inland, his timbre a steadfast rudder amid the tumult, yet the yawning casemates derided the Fiat, their vacant vaults a paean to ultras infrequent. Eclipse, the SOE's June 3rd intimations of translocation, interred in May's marginalia, now a wraith haunting the heights. The Rangers' thermite vials squandered on decoys, while the veridical quarry slumbered 400 yards southeast, shrouded in Pomerian boughs whose petals drifted like derisive laurels. The jest's undertow, however, swelled not from the casemate's emptiness, but from the plateau's nascent peril, where the 726th's counterfire knit into a tactical web that transfigured the summit into a brittle salient, the defenders' immobile creed birthing a savage ad-lib that bloodied the Rangers' roost ere they could wheel. By 8:15, as Company E's remnants under the bandaged Lieutenant Thomas Sullivan tumbled over the eastern flank, a machine gun lair in WN 72, crewed by 3 Osttruppen whose step-hardened sinews outpaced their levy pallor, raked the traverse with a millennium-round serpent, felling 4 in the exposed sward before Sergeant Bill Petty outflanked it with a commandeered Mauser, his blade muting the trio in a melee of guttural snarls and tempered steel, the lair's conquest a meagre laurel. That afforded respite, but at the forfeit of Petty's bar-bearer, toppled by a sniper's valedictory from the post's detritus. The summit sward, that cratered meadow interlaced with liaison furrows and caltrops, devolved into a tesserae of glooms where the Rangers' paramount alacrity clashed with the 726th's entrenched Gaul, Meyer decreeing his rearguards, 2 sections from the battery's retinue, to assay the peripheries with mashers and mortars, the 81mm Vents inland hawking high-explosive orbs that pockmarked the median traverse and entombed 2 more in a foxhole, their wails a descant to the Satterlee's ebbing growl as she veered east, her skipper's tally deeming the levee too steep for the fume-enshrouded cast, consigning the point to its insularity, the Rangers' diaphanous missives, heights taken, ordnance absent, questing inward, subsisting in the void as the surge wholly usurped the littoral beneath. Amid this jesting void, the Rangers' inward veer amalgamated into a schema of lopsided pursuit that abraded the Revelation's gall, metamorphosing doctrinal chagrin into a morass of inquest, where every hedgerow masked latent rumble, the barren casemates a springboard for the Pomar's reprisal. Company F, surmounting the western traverse under Captain Otto Masny circa 8:20, dispersed into the sward's western pocks, their Tommy guns scouring the wire-wreathed fosses where a duo of 726th Vigils, Poles whose apostasy murmurs had evaded ear, yielded with extremities elevated, their Mausers hurled into the verdure like discarded maledictions, the detainees' fractured Anglophone confessions spilling the enigma. Guns vanished, retreated to groves. Masny, his improvised ice axe yet clutched from the vault, relayed the lore via courier to Rudder, the colonel's incline a scintilla amid the accruing gloaming of incredulity, enjoining a detachment under Sergeant Thomas J. Trevor to scout the Vierville barricade, while the nucleus entrenched the heights. Their scrapes delved in shell cicatrices beneath the mortar's remote hack, the 726th's sallies rebuffed by condensed bar susurrus that prostrated 6 guardians in the Lear, their ebb a presage of the sword's tenuous dominion. This was no pristine annals of purgation, but an annals incised with adaptation's sable, where the Ranger's scrupulosity encountered the phantasm's guile, and the foreseen 30-minute immolation yielded to an indeterminate inquest. The summit, a frangible eyrie where occupancy solitary commenced to interweave the conflict's transmuted filament. The authentic inflection, nonetheless, kindled not from the sword's furrows, but from the Pomar's umbrageous summons, where Lomel's cadre of Company D, buttressed by Petty's Blaze squad from E, sallied southeast at 8:35, their foray a stooping wraith through the bocage's brambly pall, the Lesdang's apple copses materializing as a verdant ambuscade where the translocated ordnance slumbered beneath mesh like somnolent colossi. The revelation burgeoned in a thunderclap of unmasking, Lomel nudging aside a netting flap to unveil the premier K408's bore, its 14-ton mass cloaked amid the blooms, the retinue's vacancy a boon of the 7/16th's attenuated thews, the ranger's thermite grenades, those alabaster vials of magnesium ire, hastily shackled to the breeches with silk gunner's thread, the fuses kindling to vitality in a cascade of sabotage that contorted 3 tubes in instants, their vents contorted and inutile. As the quartet's tenders roused in a remote cote, a succinct affray felling a duo of Teutons ere the ranger's evernest, the Pomar's ire a purgative bellow that redressed the phantasm's mummery. Rudder, his sural legion swathed amid the median traverse's scrapes, assimilated the courier's pant at 9 o'clock. Ordnance located and immolated, Triad felled, his gauntlet clenching in sombre ratification, the colonel's behest undulating outward. Clutch the artery, the 352nd approaches, the heights now a barb not merely speculative but sanguine verity, the ranger's occupancy, 90 essences atop the unattainable, already abrading the Wehrmacht's suture. This Pomar's resonance cascaded through the sward like a lenitive upon lesions, the immolated ordnance, a doctrinal recalcitrance that galvanized the roost, yet the 726th's terminal paroxysm, a sally at 9:15 with a twain of sections from Meyer's rearguard, probed the airie's brittleness, the Guardian's mashers bounding into the traverses to levy 5 more rangers ere Whittington's nucleus countered with commandeered mortars, the vents hack dispersing the incursion and procuring the barricade's precipitous wire. The revelation's mortal gravity precipitated over the scrapes like a catafalque, the phantasm's hollowness alchemized into telos, the ranger's levy. 135 martyrs from 225, 60% yielded to the vault solitary. A roster whose equipoise inclined the onslaught's scala, their artery a tacit interdict that procured the strand 12 inestimable vigils. By 10 o'clock, as Omaha's fume plume blemished the orient firmament, the heights endured unbreached, its jesting void a smithy of inadvertent conquest. The rangers metal the fulcrum that upheld the onslaught's westerly suture. Their vault not merely endured but hallowed in the Pomar's muted rumble. Yet what if the ascent had buckled, the grapnel's bite yielding to the abyss's yawn and the company's silos collapsing into the tide's maw? The 352nd's 914th, unthwarted by spectral wardens, would have thundered westward unimpeded. Meyer's eastern phalanxes, 12,000 sinews tempered in Kursk's kiln, flanking Omaha's shingle slaughter to isolate V-Corps from Utah's pastoral pale. The 29th Division pinned and bled white in a 2-day vice, where Rommel's absent gaze might have kindled to lucidity, the Fox's edicts for absolute stasis inverted into a panzer torrent that could have rent the lodgements asunder, delaying the E. Cottentine's clasped by thrice the span, and courting the Luftwaffe's belated lash or the 15th Army's Calais phantoms, to materialize in earnest, Overlord's grand score unraveling not in the beach's breach, but in the point's unclaimed perch, a cascade where the phantom gun's jest became the war's epitaph, the ranger's absence the hinge that unhinged the reclamation's rim. But the cords held, the haulers hauled, and the area endured, its toll a sacrament that sealed the suture, the vertical abyss's forge yielding not perdition, but the unquenchable bastion, whose shade would yet eclipse the Teutonic tide, the unattainable not merely crested but consecrated in the phantasm's bitter redemptive jest. As the midday sun of June 6th clawed higher to bake the Pointe du Hoc's cratered crest into a furnace of sweat-slicked foxholes and brass-strewn grass, the rangers who had bartered their blood for the summit's bitter jest now hunkered in their improvised bastions along the Vierville Grand Camp highway. a ragged lattice of scraped earth and scavenged wire coiled like the spines of a cornered beast amid the bocage's thorny fringe, where the plateau sloped into the Norman meadows, their Tommy. Guns and bars trained on the inland haze, shimmering with the dust of distant probes, the air heavy with the copper reek of cordite and the low, unending mutter of wounded men sharing morphine syrettes in the shadows of shell-scarred traverses. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder, his left calf a throbbing ruin bandaged with a strip torn from a fallen comrade's shirt and propped against the bunker wall that had once housed phantom guns, paced the nascent command post with a limp that masked the fire lancing his leg, his voice a gravel anchor rallying runners who darted between outposts like wraiths in the heat. "Hold the wire. They're tasting us, but they won't swallow whole." The briefers had limbed this vigil as doctrinal epilogue, a 90-minute thorn pricking the 352nd's flank until the 29th Division clawed its exits on Omaha's shingle 5 miles east, the 7/16th's static dregs crumbling under the Rangers' elite barb, while the spiked K418s in Les Dungas orchard slumbered inert, their sabotage a coda to the climb's carnage. What the bastion became instead was a 12-hour crucible of shadows, a spectral redoubt where 90 bloodied spectres, whittled from 225 by the abyss's 70% harvest, stymied 3,000 eastern-tempered phalanges of the 352nd Infantry Division, their mere presence atop the unattainable, a silent interdict that frayed Rommel's seam and forged the Utah-Omaha suture, turning the Phantom Mandate's jest into the war's unyielding pivot, a holdout etched not in thunder, but in the unquenchable sinew of men who refused the tide's erasure. This bastion's genesis stirred not in sweeping maneuvers, but in the taciturn ferocity of entrenchment, a tactical transmutation where the summit's jesting hollowness alchemized into a snare of negation that unraveled the 352nd's momentum ere it could cohere. The division's 914th Infantry Regiment, those Kursk-kilned veterans under Colonel Karl Meyer, 12,000 thews schooled in the steppes' white inferno and redeployed for Rommel's literal vigil, lumbering westward from Formigny in the half-tracks and Opal convoys, their vanguard scouts assaying the artery at 10:15, only to shatter under a fusillade from Sergeant Lomel's forward outpost, the bars staccato felling the lead reconnaissance jeep and splintering the probe into the verges, the Rangers' commandeered Mausers yapping in pursuit, while Rudder's couriers relayed the dust wake to the Satterlee's relief echelon, her 5 inches growling a remote admonition that tethered the column shy of the heights. The 726th Residua, those 81 sentinels bloodied in the forenoon sallies, evanesced into the plateau's margins per Meyer's fiat, their capitulation piecemeal, 20-odd Poles and Ukrainians elevating limbs by 11 o'clock, their pigeon confessions affirming the orchard's doom, but their venom lingered in desultory sniper fire from the hedgerows, a parting Mauser round claiming Private Wallace as he lugged ammunition crates to the barricade, his shrapnel-mangled leg finally succumbing to the Temple's kiss, the levy cresting to 80 casualties amid the scrapes where the Rangers foraged Teutonic tinned beef and swaddled their fallen in the bocage's indifferent green, their doctrinal inquest for spectres yielding to the stark ledger of clasp and repel. Yet what buttressed this inadvertent bastion was the Perch's strategic umbra, a psychical rampart that flung elongated barbs across the inland byways, transfiguring the point from a purged parenthesis into a phantasmal warden whose occupancy vetoed the 352nd's onslaught. Meyer's panzers, 30 Mark IVs and a coterie of self-propelled 88s, halting at the bluff's coroneted contour, their commanders piping Formigny for foot screens that the 716th's attenuated cadre could no longer furnish. The immobile division's fibers taut across the 5-mile littoral, where Omaha's bellow exacted every poniard. By noon, as the sun scorched the barricade's wire into incandescent thorns, Captain Masney's Company F rebuffed a sophomore sally, 2 sections of the 914th, debarking from lorries beneath mortar aegis, the Rangers' grenades caroming into the van to disband the incursion, Petty's blaze squad outflanking with pilfered Panzerfausts that perforated an Opal and routed the column in a pall of pulverized earth, the Triumph a ragged interlude that levied 3 more lives, but bartered the Vespertines. Tenuous truce, Rudder's lesion flaring as he hobbled the perimeter, his behests a litany. Clutch the eminence, they savour us, but today they choke. The numeric recalcitrants proclaimed volumes. 90 Rangers, paired to 70 operatives by the Volt and Sallies, negating 3,000 of the 352nd's step-quenched veterans, the literal suture. Their scrapes a reticulation of interdiction, where every cartridge expended resounded the Poma's immolation. The eluded ordnance's reprisal wrought not in adamant, but in the inexorable verity of American tenacity, atop the unattainable. The bastion's mortal gravity intensified with the afternoon's erosive horizon, the ranger's seclusion, a diaphanous tether sputtering to the Prince Charles at 1 o'clock ratifying the clasp, but heralding no succor in vista, magnifying the eyrie's precarious elegance, where the sepulchred were inhumed in cursory delvings beneath the Poma's bows, and the afflicted bartered sirettes amid reminiscences of the Volt's perpendicular perdition, Lomel's cadre interchanging vigils over the contorted K418S, while Whittington's nucleus charted the juncture with Omaha's 29th. The remote susurrus of small arms from the sanguine strand, a lure that tugged at their unravelled fringes. The 726th's ultimate spasm erupted at 2:30, a forlorn sortie from the Occidental bunkers, with 20 custodians under a Feldwebel, whose cognomen the detainees subsequently murmured as Schultz, their onslaught faltering against Trevor's barricade, where bars and grenades transmuted the incursion into a debacle, 7 Teutons abandoned in the sward, and the residue fleeing inward, their recession a cession that bequeathed the sward to the Rangers' suzerainty, Meyer's 352nd skippers rerouting. Eastward through the Bocage's labyrinth, their procrastination a largesse to Gero's V Corps, where the 29th delved its egresses amid the Strand's shingle carnage. This was the inadvertent conquest's nucleus, an occupancy distilled from Phantasm's duplicity that stanched the surge not through rumble, but through relentlessness, the Rangers' levy, 135 votaries from 225, 60% yielded to the Volt solitary. A roster whose equipoise inclined the onslaught's scala, their artery a tacit interdict that procured the Strand 12 inestimable vigils. The repercussions undulated into a macro-historical rumination that bears the ponderousness of aeons, pivoted on audacity, a cogitation on conflict's mutable alembic, where mandates spawned of phantasm yield redoubts of the unforeseen. The Pointe du Hoc bastion a fulcrum that redrew not merely cartouches, but the praxis of incursion, from allied vaticination's limpid credence to the unadorned thew of mortal negation. In the Bocage's umbrageous bylanes, where the 352nd's tardy thrust dissipated into piecemeal sallies that V Corps pulverized by crepuscule, the Rangers' clasp incised a precept in the Wehrmacht's arithmetic. Immobile ramparts, perforated not by adamant solitary but by umbrae that disdained capitulation, Rommel's absentee scrutiny, yet en route from Herrlingen, occluded to the eminence's eclipse until the courier's gasps attained OKW, the Wüstenfuchs's edicts for absolute quiescence, inverted. Into the onslaught's inexorable creep. Universally, the resonance's fortified Overlord's suture, the point's negation assuring Omaha's liaison to Utah by June 7th, the Cottontown's encirclement by the 14th, and Cherbourg's capitulation by the 26th, its harbour a conduit funneling the Allies' 80 million tons of material into Europa's core. The Rangers' metal the unseen pry-bar that unlatched the fulcrum, their levy a codicil to the 6 million emancipated, yet incised in the cenotaph's granite, where the chords, phantoms suspend perennial. Philosophically, this vignette unveils a Catholic veracity in the codices of forlorn vaults. Vaticination irradiates, but volition solitary subjugates the vacuum, the point's phantasm, a dormant titan, until the Ranger's thew aroused its jeopardy, admonishing every aspirant warden that redoubts are appropriated, not in the vaticinator's ken, but in the heart's inexorable clasp, a precept that resounds through the 20th century's gales from Anzio's grottos to Iwo Jima's sulphurous reek, where, umbrae atop the unscalable transmuted surges, no fiat could foretell. The Pointe du Hoc Chronicle, that perpendicular cauldron of 1944, endures as a linchpin in annal's colossal mechanism, where the phantasmagoria of eluded ordnance encountered the calamitous veracity of recalcitrant eyrie, an inversion that murmurs to every epoch the veiled potency of occupancy amid the spectral, assuring that the conflict's gyroscope revolved not upon rumble muted, but upon eminences clutched against the unattainable's bellow.